On a late autumn morning in Paris, the sky was veiled in mist, and the sun had yet to rise above the silhouettes of the old buildings. Leo Messi, dressed in a simple gray suit, no sponsor logos, no bodyguards, no paparazzi, stepped out of a black car with diplomatic plates. He stood at the gates of the Paris Central Court, where in just a few minutes he was set to testify in a trial that, on the surface, had nothing to do with football. In his hand was a thin envelope, documents relating to a football charity project he had supported in Africa. Invited as an honorary witness, Messi assumed this would be a formality, a few statements, a commemorative photo, and he'd be back at PSG training by afternoon. But something in the air felt off. From the moment he walked into the grand hall, Messi noticed the strange glances. Not the usual admiration or curiosity he was used to. These were cold, scrutinizing stares, like he was a suspect, not a guest. A court employee, clearly uneasy, gave him directions to the courtroom without meeting his gaze. Inside, the courtroom was dim and sterile, its walls covered in dark wood paneling. Messi sat in the witness box, facing 3 judges and a row of prosecutors. No one smiled. There was no friendly greeting, no acknowledgement of his global stature, only silence and suspicion. Messi furrowed his brow, resting his hands on the wooden table, a whisper of doubt forming. Why are they looking at me like this? Then the rear door opened. A tall man in a black robe entered, silver-haired, sharp-nosed, with eyes like shards of ice. Judge Gérald Fontaine, known in Paris for his unflinching stance toward public figures and for once declaring, "I don't believe in legends, only evidence." He looked at Messi not with respect, but as if the footballer was an unwelcome presence. In that moment, Messi understood. This wasn't a celebration of goodwill. This was a confrontation, a courtroom drama where the charity work was merely a backdrop. Judge Fontaine took his seat, closed his file, and tapped his pen sharply on the bench. The sound echoed like a starting whistle, only this wasn't a game. He stared at Messi with no hint of courtesy. His voice was firm, intentionally cold. "Mr. Messi, please explain your presence today, and I hope this time you'll speak as a citizen, not as a star." A subtle murmur ran through the room. Some glanced at one another, unsure if it was a warning or a deliberate provocation. Messi raised his eyebrows slightly, then calmly replied, "I was invited to clarify a donation I made to the Sport for Hope organization. I have the full documentation here." He placed the envelope on the table, but Fontaine didn't look at it. Instead, the judge curled his lips into a faint smirk, more mockery than politeness. "Ah, donations. Yes, a world-renowned football star from Argentina, famous for his noble silence, suddenly interested in nameless children on a distant continent. Admirable. But also suspicious, wouldn't you say?" The room froze. Messi's attorney shifted as if to object, but Messi gently raised his hand, signaling him not to. He met the judge's gaze directly, unflinching. "I don't need anyone to believe me. I did it because I was once a poor kid in Rosario, and because someone believed in me when I was nobody." Fontaine hesitated, maybe surprised by the blunt sincerity. But then he chuckled softly, leaned back, and spoke louder. "This isn't about motivation, it's about facts. And the fact is, in the financial records submitted by this organization, there are funds of unclear origin, one of which came from you." Messi tilted his head slightly. "What are you implying?" "I'm saying," Fontaine emphasized each word, "that your donation, intentional or not, may have been used to cover up a chain of money laundering operations." The room held its breath. Messi's expression didn't change, but the surprise in his eyes had shifted to something else: disappointment. Not because of the accusation, but because of how this judge, this supposed defender of justice, was bending the narrative, not to seek truth, but to break down a name that had shone too brightly for too long. And in that moment he realized, this was no longer about charity. It was a match. But this time, there would be no ball, no fair referee, and his opponent wore a black robe of arrogance. Messi sat upright, his gaze steady, even though deep inside he knew he was facing a battle where the rules had seemingly been bent long before he walked in. In the past, he had stepped onto the pitch at Camp Nou under a storm of jeers from thousands of opposing fans, stood at the penalty spot in injury time with the game on the line, endured scathing headlines from the press. But never, not once, had he felt injustice as plainly as he did now, when truth had become something you had to ask permission to speak. Judge Fontaine didn't stop at vague insinuations. He began grilling Messi with a sharp tone, repeatedly cutting him off every time he tried to clarify. Each question was a carefully crafted trap, wrapped in politeness but soaked in bias and condescension. So you don't deny that you transferred 200,000 euros directly to an organization with no formal audit in place at the time? I have verification documents, Messi replied calmly, his voice low but firm. And I made the transfer through legal representation to ensure every step followed protocol. Fontaine leaned back in his chair, flipping through a notebook with mock interest before throwing out a sly remark. Well, it seems Mr. Messi has learned to speak like a politician. A few awkward chuckles rippled from the corner of the courtroom, no one quite sure if they were laughing at the joke or cringing at the judge's pettiness. Messi glanced toward the group of journalists, pens paused, heads lowered. Even they seemed to sense something wasn't right. He drew in a slow, steady breath. Your Honor, Messi said, for the first time interrupting, his voice still gentle but weighted with resolve. I don't intend to upset you. I'm here because I believe in justice. But if I'm being judged not for my actions but for my name, then just say so. So I know what it is I'm actually defending. The entire courtroom went still. Judge Gerald Fontaine flinched slightly, caught off guard not by aggression, but by the composure of the man in front of him. In his eyes flashed something, not anger, but surprise. Surprise at the way Messi didn't react like a star, or like a defendant, but like someone who knew exactly what he was worth and refused to let anyone distort it. Messi's lawyer, Mr. Delacroix, seized the moment. He stood and respectfully asked to present the full documentation, bank statements, letters of confirmation from the charity, and email exchanges between all parties. One by one, every document was laid out on the desk, clear, thorough, undeniable. There was nothing left to question. But Judge Fontaine didn't respond right away. He remained still for a few seconds, then quietly said, "We will recess while the legal board reviews the submitted evidence." The session was paused. Messi stepped out into the hallway, walking slowly. No one spoke to him, but the eyes that had been silent earlier now followed him with something different. Not curiosity, but respect. After the recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom had noticeably shifted. The media frenzy and casual chatter from earlier had faded, replaced by an eerie hush. No one dared crack jokes or make light comments anymore. Perhaps it was the clarity of the evidence Messi presented. Or maybe it was the way he faced injustice, not with outrage, but with undeniable composure. Messi returned to the courtroom, this time walking beside his lawyer, Delacroix. His demeanor hadn't changed, still calm, still composed, like the way he stands before a goalkeeper during a penalty kick. No rush, no fear. But his eyes were colder now, holding the kind of quiet steel that belongs to someone who no longer feels the need to be understood, but who now expects others to face the truth. Judge Fontaine arrived a few minutes late, but maintained his usual calm expression. He sat down, reopened the case file, and began speaking slowly. After reviewing the newly submitted documents, we find that there is currently insufficient evidence to support serious financial misconduct on the part of Mr. Lionel Messi. A wave of murmurs spread across the room. Several journalists began scribbling down notes, others exchanged glances. But Messi didn't react. He sat straight, his eyes locked on Fontaine, not to challenge him, but as if waiting for something he knew would never come, an apology. But Fontaine said nothing of the sort. Instead, he moved on to procedural matters, lowering his voice as if trying to cool the tension. Even an outsider could detect a subtle uncertainty in his tone, something rare for a veteran judge like him. Delacroix, however, remained razor-sharp. His voice was soft but piercing. He didn't just refute each claim, he exposed the bias at the heart of the trial. We're not here asking for leniency. We're here demanding fairness, something that should have been granted the moment my client walked through those courtroom doors. Then he paused, speaking even more deliberately. Being famous doesn't mean someone should be more suspect. Celebrities are human beings, and today, we've wounded a man, simply because he's too recognizable. Outside the courthouse, the media narrative had begun to shift. Sensational headlines like "Messi and Shady Charity Scandal" were updated to "Messi Produces Proof, Turns Trial Around." At the same time, the hashtag #RespectMessi began trending on social media, along with comments like, "Unbelievable how he handled that injustice with such grace." Not everyone could stay that calm in Messi's shoes today. He didn't need to say much. The truth spoke for him. As the trial neared its end, all eyes turned to Judge Fontaine, the man who had carried himself with icy poise and arrogance from the beginning. But now that posture had slipped. The overwhelming evidence, Delacroix's compelling defense, and above all, Messi's unwavering calm had shifted the momentum entirely. Fontaine cleared his throat, trying to reclaim a sense of authority. He declared, "This court will continue to monitor the situation through an independent review. But for now, there is insufficient basis to hold Mr. Messi." A few in the courtroom sighed in relief. The tension seemed to dissolve, but no one stood up or rushed out. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. And then, something completely unexpected happened. A court official entered briskly, handing a new set of documents to the clerk. After a brief check, the clerk whispered something to a plainclothes man sitting quietly at the back, someone no one had noticed until now. He was a representative of the High Judiciary Council. In an instant, a few uniformed officers calmly stepped toward the judge's bench, not toward Messi, but toward Judge Fontaine. "Judge Fontaine," one officer said, "we've received orders to detain you for investigation into abuse of power and judicial bias in this case. We need you to come with us immediately." The courtroom froze. Fontaine went pale. He stammered, trying to maintain his composure. This is a misunderstanding. I'm a judicial officer. You can't just..." But the officers gently placed a hand on his shoulder, not forceful, but firm enough to say, "Your time is up." Messi sat there, no smile, no applause, no triumphant reaction. He simply watched as someone who had just witnessed the fall of a power once thought untouchable. Delacroix turned to him and gave a respectful nod, not just because his client had been vindicated, but because he had weathered it all, without ever losing who he was. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted, not like after a football victory, but like in the wake of a moment when justice had finally found its voice. Hashtags like "Justice for Messi," "Messi vindicated," and "Truth prevails" flooded every corner of social media within hours. After leaving the courtroom, Messi stepped outside between two lines of people who had gathered to wait for him. Unlike the usual chaos after a football match, there were no screams for autographs, no desperate calls for selfies. Instead, there was a deep, heavy silence, a silence filled with respect. Everyone stood still, as if they had just witnessed not just a verdict, but an awakening. Antonella and the three kids were waiting for him just outside. The moment Tiago saw him, he ran ahead and threw his arms around his father, without asking a single question, just holding him tightly. Messi knelt to embrace his children, then looked up at Antonella. She didn't speak, but her eyes, warm, proud, and unwavering, said everything. On the way back, Messi didn't go straight home. He asked the driver to take a detour to an old park, the one he used to bring the kids to when they first moved to Paris. Sitting on a familiar stone bench, he let out a long breath, not out of exhaustion, but as if finally releasing a weight that had been pressing on his chest for days. Antonella sat beside him, her hand still holding his. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Messi nodded gently. "Not because the court ruled in my favor, but because they finally saw the truth." After a pause, he continued, "I didn't need people to defend me. I just needed one thing, for justice, even if late, to still arrive." A few people passing through the park recognized him, but no one approached. A boy around 10 years old simply raised his hand and waved, eyes shining with admiration. Messi smiled and nodded in return, and in that quiet moment, the boy's gaze seemed to carry an entire generation. A generation growing up not just watching Messi on the pitch, but learning from the values he lives by. Not long after, a major French newspaper published an article with the headline, "Messi, his greatest victory wasn't a goal." The story quickly went viral across social media, not because of scandal, but because of inspiration. People stopped talking about the lawsuit and instead spoke about how he stood tall in the face of injustice. Several universities and international education organizations began referencing the story as a case study in personal integrity, patience, and dignity in adversity. And the most remarkable part was Messi's quiet humility. He didn't post a thank you message, didn't give post-trial interviews, because for Messi, a true victory isn't something you use to prove anything to the world. It's something that lets you look in the mirror and see a man who never stopped being himself. No matter how many storms he walked through, no matter how many spotlights tried to pierce straight through to his heart. A few weeks after the trial, Messi's life slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Morning training sessions, weekend matches, and afternoons spent walking his kids to school or kicking a ball around the garden. But from that day on, something had changed. Not in him, but in how the world saw him. On television talk shows, commentators no longer described Messi solely with words like genius, football artist, or the king of records. Now, they used terms like a man of principle, a role model for the next generation, and a living legend, not just because of football. The newspapers that once questioned his silence as dodging responsibility now praise that same quiet composure as proof of his belief in justice. One morning, in PSG's locker room, Mbappé walked over and handed Messi a copy of a major sports magazine. On the cover was a photo of Messi walking past a swarm of reporters with calm eyes after the trial, alongside the bold headline, "The man who didn't need to shout to make the world listen." Messi looked at it and simply smiled. He didn't say a word. But his teammates understood. They were witnessing something rare. A global superstar who held on to simplicity, humility, and kindness, even after walking through one of the most public storms of his life. One day, a high school in Argentina sent Messi a special request. They wanted to name their main hall Aula Messi, not for his football career, but because he represents calm strength, resilience, and character. In the letter, the principal wrote, "We don't need a glamorous speech. We just want to tell our students that there was once a man who was insulted in a court of law, and he didn't scream. He simply stood his ground." Messi read the letter sitting in his living room while his kids ran around laughing and playing. He folded it gently and placed it in a drawer, then turned to Antonella and said, "I used to think people would only remember me for my goals, but maybe what they remember longer is how I stayed kind when no one thought I would." It wasn't a grand statement, but Antonella knew it was one of the most profound things he'd ever said. And from that moment on, it wasn't just Messi who stepped out of the shadow of a court case. The image of who he was in the eyes of the world became clearer than ever before. Not just a football legend, but a man who could walk silently through judgment and still make the world listen, with nothing but quiet dignity. The story of Lionel Messi and the way he handled being disrespected in a courtroom is not simply a clash between fame and authority. It's a powerful lesson in composure, integrity, and the strength of restraint. In a world where loud reactions, quick retorts, and aggressive responses are often mistaken for strength, Messi chose silence. Not because he was weak, but because he understood. Truth doesn't need to shout to be real. He didn't allow himself to be pulled into an emotional game set by others. Instead, he walked through it with clarity and dignity. It was his calm, his commitment to staying true to his values, and his unwavering belief in the truth that ultimately forced those who disrespected him to face the consequences without him ever needing to retaliate. The greatest lesson here is this: when we are underestimated, misunderstood, or even insulted, what makes us truly strong isn't how fast we fight back. It's how firmly we stand, how deeply we stay rooted in who we are, and how our own decency becomes the clearest, loudest answer of all. Greatness isn't about winning an argument. It's about preserving our character, even when others abandon theirs. Messi didn't need to raise his voice to prove this. It was his perfectly timed silence and his dignified actions that made the world pause and reflect. And that, in the end, was his greatest victory. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming content.